So many places to be.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, good day. My name is Joe Fish-Kay. I'm Principal Research Scientist in the Emerging Technologies team, and it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce you to Kate Starbird. Kate is going to be talking about bots and trolls, right? And going beyond these designations to really understand what it means to address these as questions. And this is a topic which hits Mozilla's interest in so many different ways. We obviously have this interest around disinformation, right? People are using the internet and we're seeing problems with that. But we've also got our own problems with bots and trolls. And I wanted to take this opportunity to mention that for Mozilla employees and contributors, we have systems in place so that if you find that you are being targeted or harassed, talk to a manager, ping me, and we can put you in touch with people who can help you with those processes. I don't think that's a total solution, and as Kate will explain, it's only a very small part of what a solution might look like, but it does point to a way in which we take this really seriously for Mozillians. So, I'm really excited by this talk. I'm really excited to introduce you to Kate, whose work I've admired for a long time. Without any further ado, Kate Starbird.
All right, thank you, Joe Fish. So as he said, I'm going to talk a little bit about bots and trolls, but really what I want to do is actually push our conversation beyond bots and trolls and kind of think more holistically about the problems of disinformation and others in this space. So fake news, political propaganda, information war. In the last couple of years, we've been introduced to a lot of new terms that attempt to describe some of the toxicities that we're perceiving in the information space. And I'm not going to take all of these on today. I really want to focus on two of these terms, mostly disinformation, a little bit of information operations. I might use that term, but I'm going to try to focus on this term disinformation and talk a little bit about what it means. But our lab has been studying disinformation for a few years now, but we actually didn't start out to study disinformation. Like many online users out there, we sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole. We were initially looking at my first line of research that kind of intersects here was we were looking at online volunteerism and online political activism, but around different kinds of crisis events and political movements. And we were looking at how volunteers use online tools to organize. And this is actually going to come back a little bit to how I'm going to talk about disinformation later. But that was my first area of research. And then about 2013, my collaborators and I began to study online rumors during crisis events and looked at how people were trying to make sense of crisis events and figure out what was going on. And often that turned out to be rumors and misinformation. But in around 2015 and 2016, we began to realize that we weren't just looking at accidental rumors and misinformation, but we were actually beginning to see pervasive disinformation. And not just pervasive disinformation at the margins, which is where we thought it was, but we started to see that disinformation percolate up into the Twitter accounts of influencers and eventually political leaders. And because we saw that kind of that new relevance to disinformation, we began to make that the focus of our research. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about mostly disinformation. I want to help kind of define and contextualize that term, help you understand how it works, where it comes from, and then give you a few examples of how online disinformation works. And as I do that, I want to correct some misperceptions and add some nuance to our definition of disinformation, because I think that's going to be really important. I'm also going to discuss some technology and policy implications, and I hope this number 5 is a hope, and I'm not sure I'm going to achieve it, is to end on a little less hopeless note. I have been giving talks for a couple years now that have been really depressing, and I'm on sabbatical right now. I was telling Joe Fish that I'm not feeling as depressed myself, perhaps because I'm well slept, but I'm also thinking that there is sort of a turning point of us kind of starting to think about potential solutions, or not just solutions, but kind of a more hopeful future, even though we know that there's a problem here with online misinformation, disinformation, and other things. So the first thing I want to do is distinguish between these two terms, and I think this is an important place to start, between misinformation and disinformation. The differences between the two are actually really important when we start to talk about solutions And so I think it's a good place to start. So one high-level way to characterize a distinction between the two is one of intent, simply intent. Misinformation is information that is false, but not necessarily deliberately so. And disinformation is intentionally false information. And this is a pretty working definition. This is the one I give to my students. It's the one I start out with. But actually, in another view, disinformation isn't simply about intent. The term disinformation has other more specific meanings and a historical context. It's been connected to this term, desinformacja, which originated in Soviet intelligence. And it has kind of a history of a certain kind of political propaganda. Our understanding of disinformation in our lab, and actually in the community that's building around these studies, is informed by the work of Ladislav Bittman, who was a practitioner of Soviet disinformation. He was a member of the Czech intelligence, and he defected to the United States in 1968 and became a professor of disinformation. And then he wrote a lot about his experiences and his understanding of disinformation as a practitioner. And we've been borrowing from Bittman to define disinformation as a suite of tactics applied by influence agents to manipulate information spaces to achieve strategic political objectives. It's important to note, and I want to stress this, that not all disinformation, historical or modern, is connected to Russia. In fact, right now in 2020 election, I think we're going to really be looking at domestic actors, and that's going to be really important. But Russian intelligence has been, or Soviet intelligence and now Russia, have been innovators in the space of disinformation. I think it's important to appreciate how they work and what they've done. And so I'm going to present 3 case studies of recent online disinformation, 2 with very strong connections to Russia's intelligence apparatus, and the other with more tenuous connections, but they do intersect in interesting ways, not just with Russian disinformation, but disinformation from other nation states. These are long-term studies that took place over the course of multiple years within our lab. Before I go too far in, I want to do a little methods interlude. I think the methods that we use are probably the most important piece of our research contribution to this growing field and this study. I don't think that I'd be standing here today giving a talk like this if it wasn't for the methods that we've been using for several years. Our methods are profoundly mixed method. We conduct iterative, qualitative, and quantitative interpretive analysis of big social data and other online content. We dive into data at different levels. We're not afraid to read thousands and thousands of tweets and look at accounts. And then we also step back and visualize data in different ways to look at patterns, identify anomalies, develop hypotheses. Oh, what's going on there? I think it might be this. More often than not, we go in and find nothing's going on there. It's not what we thought. But at times we go in and find really interesting things. And so it's our very close engagement with the data and our movement across different kind of scales that I think has been really important for us in terms of understanding what this phenomena is. To some extent, the case studies I'm going to present here are all cross-platform. Disinformation is profoundly multi-channel, but we often start with Twitter data because that's what we have. That's what we've had. This is changing a little bit. Currently, we're starting to get access to other platforms, but all of our case studies begin with Twitter data, and I can talk about that in the questions. I'm also going to apply sort of a socio-technical lens to this, which is comes from my experience in my field of computer-supported cooperative work, and it's also kind of intersecting with the methods that we use as we're kind of looking at how social actions taken in the world are shaped by norms, and they're shaped by technologies, and also those actions shape those norms and in some ways shape those technological or socio-technological systems. And I think this kind of perspective on how these things work together gets us away from simplistic ideas of oh, we have this disinformation campaign and we're going to measure the outcomes, and they heard this message and they voted this way or didn't vote this way, and that's how we're going to measure things. I think it's a much more complex system than that, and that's how we see it, and that's how I hope to be kind of communicating some of that nuance in this talk. So the first case study I want to focus on is the case of Russian interference in the 2016 US election. In this research study, we've done several different papers on this. In this research study, we actually didn't start out looking at disinformation. We actually started out studying framing contests in Black Lives Matter discourse. I had a student who was really interested in how the Black Lives Matter movement was organizing, and he wanted to kind of understand how they were kind of bringing resources to bear. And so we were looking at that conversation, and then we started noticing sort of a counter conversation. And this is sort of a very highly polarized conversation, and we began to study that kind of polarization and the conversations there. So this is from data related to shooting events in 2016. We generated a data set of tweets that had either Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter in it. And we created a structural graph of that data. And so this graph has, in this graph, every little node or circle there is an account. And those accounts are clustered together. It's a retweet network graph. The accounts are clustered together. They're closer together if they retweeted each other, and they're further apart if they didn't. The edges are missing. We removed the edges here because it gets really ugly, but I'll show you some edges later. But so just the edges are invisible, but they're pulling accounts closer together if they retweeted each other. And what you can see here is two different separate communities, or echo chambers. We can talk about it in a different way as polarization, but two different communities on either side of the conversation. We have pro-Black Lives Matter accounts on the left, and it was also politically left, and then anti-Black Lives Matter on the right, which was also sort of politically right. And the two sides created and spread very different frames about police shootings of African American citizens. And so we were looking at this, we studied it, we wrote this paper, we published that paper in October 2017. And a couple weeks after we published it, in November 2017, Twitter released a list of accounts associated with Russia's Internet Research Agency, which had been running disinformation operations online during that time, targeting US populations. Just had another US Senate report about this, came out this week. This is sort of an established phenomenon. So when Twitter releases this list, it's the first time we have a list of these are known IRA accounts. I looked over the list, I was like, holy moly, I recognized some of these accounts in the list. We'd featured some of the accounts in our earlier paper. They were in excerpts, they were in tables. They had been some of the most influential accounts in the conversation. So I had my students, I said, can you go run those accounts over this graph to see where Russia's trolls were in this conversation? And so the troll accounts here are mapped in orange, and here we show sort of the edges are retweets of their accounts in orange as well. And so you can see that the Russian information operations or disinformation agents were active on both sides of the Black Lives Matter conversation. A few were among the most influential accounts in the conversation. One of the accounts on the left was retweeted by Jack and me. So several accounts on the right had integrated into other grassroots online organizing efforts on the conservative side. They were following those accounts. Those accounts were following them. They'd become part of these follow back groups on the right that are very good at organizing. I'd love to talk about that another time as well. So they were in both sides. So my PhD student, Emir Arif, conducted in-depth qualitative research on the accounts in orange. He found that the IRA accounts enacted multidimensional online personas across platforms that played on stereotypes of African Americans on one side and white US conservatives on the other. They were impersonating activists and also modeling for others what online activism looked like. They were shaping the information space. They were reflecting norms, but also, to some extent, shaping them. Often their content wasn't superficially problematic or any different from what others in the space were doing. They were tweeting about strong Black voices on the left or support of US veterans on the right. They were cultivating audiences for future strategic messaging. In other places, they were sowing and amplifying division. Some of their content was among the most vitriolic content in the space, advocating for violence against police on the left and using racial epithets on the right. In a few places, we can see them holding arguments with themselves, like a puppeteer having one of their accounts on the right fight with one of their accounts on the left. We now know a lot more about this activity. A year after Twitter released the first list of accounts, they actually released all of the data from all of the accounts that they had found to be associated with the IRA in their project Sunlight. And we were able to take that data and analyze it. And this is actually, what was interesting for us is that we figured out that what we had found in that two sides of that conversation was a significant part of their operations. In fact, it was we had found evidence of most of their operation, like a window into a bigger set, but this was a core part of their operation. So this is a retweet network graph, kind of a similar property here, of the IRA accounts that retweeted each other. So these are just IRA accounts to show where they were amplifying each other. And it actually reveals 4 clusters of different kinds of accounts that they used. So they had these you might have heard about this, they impersonated news accounts in the US, including one that was in Seattle that looked very much like a real group there. So they had a bunch of fake news accounts. Literally, they were fake news accounts. A group of hashtag warriors, the way they played these little games to try to get people to engage with them. And then 2 politicized persona groups, one on the US right and one in sort of the African American community or Black community or African American activists up there in the blue. So these are the core part of this is most of their successful operations. And I'm going to kind of talk to you a little bit about that. This is new stuff. I haven't published on it, but I have started to give a few talks on it. So if we look at the basic stats around these clusters, so the cluster in blue, these are the accounts we're talking about as being associated with the African American community. They actually use terms like Black community, Black to live, Blacktivist, and some other terms there. These are hashtags that were in their profiles. In the US right, you can see things like conservative, TCOT, which is an old hashtag. It means top conservative on Twitter. Wake Up America, PJNet, which is a fascinating thing about how conservatives organize online. So these are accounts, these are the terms that were prominent in the IRA troll accounts that were in these 2 clusters. And so you can kind of get a sense of who they are and what they were trying to do. Similar to those images I showed you earlier. So what was interesting is that we now know the IRA had been using troll accounts to participate in and try to manipulate US discourse in the US and elsewhere since maybe 2010, but most of those efforts had very little impact. This is actually a graph of their tweets over time. And they spike at different times. Most of this is really spammy, and a lot of it was automated, especially early. But if you look at this, and that's been shrunk, and I'm going to overlay the graph of their retweet count per day, you can see that they actually, initially don't get any retweets. No one's following them. No one's paying attention to them until about July 2015. And in July 2015, what they did was they started to establish those personas that we talked about, those US right-leaning personas and those African American Black Lives Matter activist personas on the left. And it was when they started to develop those personas that their content started to take off in the US. That's when they started to get retweets, and in fact, when you look at this graph here, most of their retweets are from a very small number of accounts. It's about 300, 150 on one side, 150 on the other side. And that's almost all of their retweets of all of their operations. To give you a little better, a different view of this, these are kind of the account clusters that we had. They had about, the 134 accounts that we clustered with the Black Lives Matter activists, 154 we clustered with the right side, and they sent almost the same number of tweets. So there was very parallel operations. They were a little more successful on the right, but that's not here or there. And interestingly, though they were yelling at each other, they were often, sowing and amplifying division, these kinds of things. They converged in a couple of different ways. They converged to attack media, and they converged in support of Donald Trump's presidency. On the right, they were very active. They said, let's go vote for Trump. And on the left, they tried to encourage people not to vote at all, people that were Democrat. So stepping back, we can look at this as a multi-year campaign to infiltrate and shape political discourse in the United States. It was orchestrated by a group with ties to the Russian government, and we can see them burrowing into and working within organic online communities. We can talk about this also as highly orchestrated, and I'm going to come back to this because the other examples that I'm going to give are not. This is highly orchestrated behavior. This is a group. They're organized. They're inside a building. They're working together. They're given some kind of directions every day of what they're supposed to be tweeting about, and they're trying to infiltrate and shape these conversations. So the second case study, so I'm going to shift now. The second case study looks at disinformation during armed conflict. This is a really hard case study, and I'm just going to acknowledge that right off. Since 2017, we've been looking at online discourse related to the civil war in Syria. In particular, we've been focusing on discourse surrounding the work of the Syria Civil Defense, also known as the White Helmets. It's a volunteer rescue group that works in rebel-held areas of Syria. They do search and rescue. They provide medical aid to people that are impacted by the civil war there. Again, it's very important to note they work in the rebel-held areas, so they're not working in the areas that are controlled by the Syrian regime. The White Helmets also document these impacts. In this case of this tweet here, specifically calling out the Syrian government's Russian allies and claiming that they specifically target aid workers. They also have videos of the impacts of air attacks from Russian planes and similar kinds of things. And so this content that they've shared has served to some extent to garner solidarity with and sympathy for the Syrian people from Western audiences. In particular, in about 2016, there was a documentary about the White Helmets, and their content, they won an Oscar for the documentary, and their content was actually beginning to change some conversations in the West. And this is about when they became targeted very specifically by a disinformation campaign. In 2017, 2018, when we started studying this conversation, if you search Twitter or Google for White Helmets, you may have found some tweets supporting them. But most likely you would have encountered content like this, content that challenges the White Helmets, claiming that they're a propaganda construct of the West, equating them with terrorists, calling them crisis actors. In our research on this conversation, like I said, we've been doing it for years, and we still have open studies here. We began with a collection of tweets around the White Helmets. This is one representation of that data. In the center of this graph is a retweet network graph again. This is the last time I'll show you one of those. I'll show you other kinds of graphs later. But so again, this is a retweet network graph. In this case, the nodes are sized by the number of retweets they receive, and they are clustered together, and they're attached by edges when one account retweets another. Again, you can see a polarized conversation, and in this case, we have pro-White Helmets content on the left. In effect, Syria Civil Defense is the official count of the White Helmets. And then on the right, you have anti-White Helmets content. It's persistently, consistently the kind of content that I showed you above. Typically, I would not show a lot of the names of certain accounts. If people are thinking that they're anonymous, but these accounts that you can see here if you can see their name here, they are accounts that have hundreds of thousands of followers and that have been consistently active and in many cases are journalists. And we could talk more about that because I've made a conscious decision to not anonymize in this case. So as you can see in this conversation, the red cluster is dominating this conversation. Their activity is persistent over time. Many of the same accounts repeatedly tweeting and retweeting content that specifically attacks the White Helmets. They're literally drowning out the voices of accounts on the other side. But who are these accounts dominating this conversation? The top influencers include self-described journalists that consistently produce content aligned with Syrian and Russian government interests. There are also officials from the Syrian government, which you would expect, and other governments as well. And we can see that a few of what seem to be inauthentic and likely paid or organizationally controlled troll accounts. But inauthentic troll accounts make up only a tiny percentage of the content in this conversation. And we did not find bots that were contributed in any significant way. Many of the accounts in red, most of the smaller ones that you can't see the names of, are unaffiliated accounts who identify as activists. They're the ones that are actually doing the tweeting and keeping this going. They're not paid, and they're not controlled. They're sincere activists in this space. Many have been active in other political conversations. A large chunk have tweeted pro-Palestinian content. Many identify as anti-imperialist and anti-war. A lot of these accounts look a lot like my research group who was studying this conversation. We share, you feel like you share a lot of their values if you look at their, if you're a left-leaning person and you look at their account profiles, and yet we're seeing them in this case be very specifically attacking this group. And I'm going to talk about how that affected us later. So what are they doing? They're participating in what very much looks like online activism. They're sharing articles and videos that support their narratives. They mention each other a lot. They often whistle and then dogpile people. So when they see content that's supporting the white helmets, the folks in red will call it out, and all of a sudden they will converge. Sorry, I'm expecting something here. That's right. So I'm going to show you a little example. This was after I wrote the paper about this. I put out a tweet to say, hey, I just wrote a paper about all these case studies, and I'm doing this. And soon Max Blumenthal found me, and he claimed that I was citing new knowledge, integrity issue. Anyways, he tried to use a guilt by association to make claims of CIA, NSA, and FBI affiliations for me. And then more anonymous activists, actually this is one that people have seen a lot, but I'm going to gray him out anyways, maintain Orwellian authoritarian control of the proletariat. Anyways, you can see where this is going. I'm served NATO interests, apparently, and I've been at a meeting with James Clapper once. I get spoon-fed the script. And then this guy created an account impersonating an actual academic, and he had just created it that day, and said, I'm glad I'll never get to meet you. I actually replied back, and I told him the feeling was mutual. And so they mobilize very quickly to kind of attack and challenge this. PhD, she needs someone to contact her lawyers to pursue a refund from my PhD. And then my favorite, this is my favorite. She's just frustrated old American spinster who could not get an American college football player to marry her. That one I had to frame that one. That was my favorite one. But anyways, what you get is, and this doesn't just happen to me. I mean, this is what happens anytime anyone in that blue says anything. They just get dogpiled by this group because they're very active. So they're persistent. They tweet about the white helmets for months, years. They activate at opportune times to capitalize on new information that can help them make their case and distract from breaking news events that are not aligned with their narratives. And they organize. In many ways, they look a lot like the disaster volunteers that I used to study, using Twitter and other platforms to coordinate and collaborate, to recruit members, to spread their messages. This is very much sort of collaborative work. It looks very much like the collaborative work I used to study. Around the outside of this graph are a different kind of node. They're web domains or websites that are linked to from tweets shared by the accounts. So these are, in this case, around the outside circle are domains that we had links to from inside the tweets. And so they're connected there, and they're sized by the relative number of tweets that went to each domain. You can see, YouTube up there is prominent. I'm not going to talk about that today. We're studying that now. I don't have a lot of results on that. But I want to focus in on these two of the top domains supporting this conversation are RT, formerly Russia Today, and Sputnik News. Both domains are part of the Russia's government media and influence apparatus. They're controlled partially by the Russian government, and they're there purposefully to as a propaganda kind of apparatus for the government. In the White Helmets conversation, these news domains provide content, including video content of the conflict and interviews with voices that share their objectives. They shape narratives. They amplify voices of anti-White Helmets influencers. They repeatedly interview the journalists who are among the most retweeted in this conversation. And often those journalists link back to their interviews on RT, demonstrating this kind of cross-promotion. And so these websites are a resource for the activity that's happening there in the anti-White Helmets conversation. There are other domains in pink, this is kind of around the bottom, and others, that function as a kind of gray propaganda. We actually, one of the things we noticed when we first started studying this conversation was, first of all, it was extremely disorienting. Our researchers, many of us are left-leaning, identified with sort of anti-imperialist, left-leaning and international. The research team was very international, and so a lot of the anti-White Helmets narratives initially resonated with my students that were studying this, and they would go online and they would say, I saw this one article. Yeah, one article's on RT. I rejected that, but I saw the same kind of content, and I was seeing it, in this one place, Mint Press News, and I really like that site. It really speaks to me. And it wasn't until we were able to step back and map what was going on that they began to understand that the same content was being shared across all of these different sites. And it gave them this kind of false sense of triangulation. So they were getting the same ideas. So this map actually is, in this case, we took all the articles, and if the same article appeared in two different websites, we created a link. And the link is stronger for the number of articles that appear on both of them. So Mint Press News and 21st Century Wire have a pretty strong link. They had like 6 of the same articles in the period of time we were looking at appeared on both sites. And so what we had here is this kind of a network where they're content sharing of the articles. For a lot of these places, for a lot of the little ones in there, there's some terrible, terrible little sites in there. There are things called Jew World Order. There's also little, the Truth Seeker, the free thought projects and different kinds of things that are like conspiracy, they just put out whatever in terms of conspiracy theories. But then there's other sites that really have, they have an ideology and they're saying these things. And what's happening is there's this content sharing where some of these sites just like the free content and they're putting it up there when they can because they're getting access to this content. And others have sort of this political propaganda mission where they're putting certain kinds of content out there that aligns with their perspectives. And we've got, what's interesting here is that you can see the same articles dressed up in different wrappers designed for different audiences. We have disaffected U.S. veterans, uprooted Palestinians, anti-imperialist think tanks, anti-war activists, alt-right patriot sites, and a multitude of sites dedicated to conspiracy theorizing on various topics. The structure functions to bring ideologically distinct and in some cases seemingly oppositional domains together around common narratives and perspectives. This gives the appearance of a diverse set of people converging around the same ideas, a sense of triangulation, but false triangulation. It's also possible and even likely, considering what we know about historical strategies and what we're seeing in other cases, is that these content sharing practices are micro-targeting specific communities with strategic narratives through websites designed to speak to different audiences. So stepping back, we see a couple different things happening here, but we're looking at this as a persistent campaign of at least partially organic political activism supported by Russia's government, by their media apparatus, and in alignment with their political objectives. This is not orchestrated like what we saw before. There aren't just a set of trolls somewhere that are the whole disinformation activity isn't just organized in some room in St. Petersburg, but it's cultivated, and the Russian information apparatus amplifies friendly voices, provides a platform for journalists whose stories align with their narratives, lifts their profile, hosts content on their flagship sites, but also allows their content to flow through various gray propaganda sites. They make it available and freely shared across that network we showed. They encourage viewers to question more while spreading dozens of narratives that attempt to sow doubt about who the White Helmets are and what they do. All right, the third case study, actually, you know what? I think I'm going to skip the third case study because I'm going to for timing, I want to get to the other part. Third case study is basically about conspiracy theorizing online, and it talks about how we started with conspiracy theories of crisis events, people that claim that shooting events in the US don't happen. But we talk about how conspiracy theorizing serves as a vector for disinformation, and how we can find communities that are almost organic in the fact that they don't need any outside group to help them start their conspiracy theorizing, but they've become sort of a soft space where disinformation agents can easily target them to spread their own conspiracy theories, and so they act as sort of a vector of disinformation, and we can see that in cases like what was happening after El Paso. We can see that in cases around Seth Rich and other kinds of things. We can see this kind of conspiracy theorizing community where they don't believe the media, they don't trust Western governments. They're very kind of susceptible to ideas of like a deep state. That narrative landed very well in sort of a community that already had this kind of conspiracy theorizing about how the world works. And then they become this sort of organic and emergent behavior, but it can actively spread sort of disinformation narratives. And we're seeing these communities start conspiracy theories that are then spreading up to influencers and spreading up to political leaders, not just here in the US, but elsewhere in the world as well. So this is the other kind of case study. But I wanted to go through it fast because I really want to get to sort of adding nuance to our evolving understanding of online disinformation. So I want to use some of the material from the studies I talked about, and want to revisit our understanding of disinformation to share a couple of things we've learned about what it is, how it works, why we're vulnerable, and why solutions aren't so simple. So the first thing is that disinformation is not simply false information. And in fact, sometimes it isn't false at all. To be effective, disinformation layers truth with lies, often building on a true or plausible core, but then adding new details and omitting others to shape a specific narrative towards a specific strategic objective. In the IRA Troll Case, the troll accounts misled their audiences about who they were and what their intentions or motivations were. They attempted to shape political discourse and political action, in that case voting, of the communities they infiltrated towards objectives that those communities were not aware of and likely did not share. In the White Helmets case, we can see narratives like this one built from factual information that the White Helmets and others provide about the funding they receive from Western governments, and evidence such as the videos the White Helmets themselves produced documenting regime atrocities, and then they use that evidence in combination to claim that they're therefore a propaganda construct of the West. According to the activists in pink in that website in that graph I showed, and the media that support them, the White Helmets are paid by Western governments to create propaganda meant to change how people see the war. It's a compelling narrative that's hard to problematize as simply true or false. It's strategic. Another insight from this work is that we need to consider or reconsider our unit of analysis. It's not always effective to think of disinformation as a single piece of information, but instead to think of it as a campaign. Bittman uses that unit of analysis, talking about disinformation efforts as part of an information operation or campaign. And borrowing from his characterization in our analyses of modern disinformation, we agree that it's useful to think of disinformation not as a quality of a specific piece of information, but as a collection of information actions or a campaign. This is going to have impact on how we think about fact-checking or how we think about solutions in the technical space. When we're looking at conspiracy theories of crisis events, in part, they exist in a messy space where the echo of old campaigns can be heard and the community is softened for the messaging and narratives. Anyway, but looking at the 2016 election interference in the US, we can see a multi-channel, multi-dimensional campaign. On the IRA side, we talk about Twitter, but the troll activity was multi-platform. It was on Facebook, it was on Instagram, they were commenting on websites and forums, they were making SoundCloud playlists and distributing things. So it was multi-platform, but it wasn't just social media campaign or just the IRA and its trolls. It included the release of stolen emails that had been repeatedly associated with Russian hackers, the use of gray propaganda sites to push their narratives, the manipulation of mainstream media to spread their stolen content, and the infiltration of other social and political organizations. It's not just one troll, it's not just one set of activities, it's a much larger thing. In the White Helmets example, it's not just a single piece of information or even a single narrative, but an onslaught of stories that built into several connected narratives using Twitter and YouTube, and in combination with connected media strategies across dozens of gray propaganda sites. This effort sought to undermine the White Helmets, especially their efforts to garner sympathy from global audiences, but also to connect them to terrorists on one hand and narratives questioning Western intervention and challenging Western media on the other. I end with one of their most recent narratives, a tweet featuring an RT interview with a prominent journalist in this space, Vanessa Beeley, where she claims that the White Helmets are trafficking in the organs of children. And I'm going to leave that there. So considering these two together, the unit of analysis for disinformation is a campaign, and the disinformation is not simply false information. As we turn to questions of detection, which is an important area for research, especially in online environments, this means that identifying disinformation isn't about determining the truth value of a specific post or the authenticity of a single account, but to think about how that post and account fit into a larger campaign where the underlying intent is to mislead for a strategic political purpose. In this view, disinformation remains disinformation regardless of who the intermediary is. A person does not need to be aware of their role in the campaign to be a participant. This gets to the point that we highlighted in the title of the talk. A lot of this research has been focused on detected automated activity or bots or inauthentic accounts, trolls. But disinformation isn't just about bots and trolls. As we see in our studies, it targets, infiltrates, cultivates, shapes, and ultimately leverages online crowds and communities. Bittman talked about the role that unwitting agents play in historical disinformation campaigns. But here we can see agents working with, collaborating with online crowds or unwitting crowds to achieve their goals. So I encourage researchers and platform designers not just to focus on the orange parts of the graph on the left, but to look at the blue and the pink in the graph on the right to study how online communities are targeted and affected by disinformation, how some members of those unwitting crowds take it up and make it their own, eventually generating their own propaganda-like messages that reflect the narratives of the disinformation operatives. And this is really important. We're all vulnerable to disinformation. When we went to study the white helmets conversation, we were completely disoriented at first. It took us, we kept asking the people we were working with, is this really propaganda? Is this really wrong? Some of this looks very, it looks true to me. And we got very confused because of the way that these messages were set up. And they were all on these different websites. And the messages, in many cases, those websites were designed to talk to people like us. And so the experience is that one of my students will describe it as completely disorienting, as if like there's just static on all the time, and he's unable to kind of find the signal with the noise. And in some cases, not in some cases, it was never about, well, I'll get to that in 2 slides. So looking beyond a single campaign, the pervasive use of disinformation has consequences for societies experiencing it. One of those is diminished trust in information. We've talked a lot about that here. Disinformation reduces our ability to know whom and what to trust, with the idea that when people don't know where to go for information they can trust, they lose their agency, their ability to take decisions based on knowledge in the world. There's also, we see direct attacks on the media. One of the prominent things in the IRA data set were attacks on the media. In this case, they say CNN is ISIS. We have tweets in the Syria data set we have. Same thing, CNN is ISIS. It's like the same catchphrase was used in both. But you can see this sort of direct attack on media happening in these spaces. It's also not just fake news or mainstream media that we can trust. It's also about anything you encounter online. That account that you're arguing with, just label them a Russian troll and block them, right? So now that we don't know that if we can actually trust who's there, we've got trolls in the space, we begin to lose our faith that the information spaces are as they seem. And this, this is just an example of kind of our erosion of being able to trust that things are as they seem. In their insightful essay on the menace of unreality, Pomerantsev and Weiss describe how the purpose of disinformation is not to convince. The purpose of disinformation is to confuse, to create muddled thinking across society, with this idea that a society that doesn't know where it can go for trusted information is a society that's easily controlled. And this loss of trust feeds into this sort of more troubling point that disinformation undermines democratic societies. It destabilizes the common ground that we need to stand upon to govern ourselves. It undermines our shared reality. We lose trust in information, in the confidence that we know what we know, that things are as they seem. If you notice the positioning in these orange clusters on the outside of these communities, this is helping to pull these communities further apart. This is empirical, but it's also metaphorical. Disinformation tears at the fabric of the social fabric. It amplifies existing divisions, and if the divisions become too extreme, we can't come together to govern ourselves. And this is one of the things that a lot of folks including this great article by Henry Farrell, talk about how it's not just harassment or that we are exposed to fake news, it's actually undermining democratic societies more profoundly. The tactics and effects of disinformation are resonating with features of our sociotechnical environments. We know this. Affordances like anonymity, phenomena like echo chambers, political polarization, the fact that we can access these platforms from anywhere in the world and they can access into political activist communities. Social media did not start this fire, but they have become fuel for it. and online tools more broadly. They're appropriated by individuals, organizations, and governments all over the world, and they're kind of undermining what we care about. And so, as folks that are part of these socio-technical systems or build the systems that shape these behaviors, I think that it's important to understand that we're part of this system. Addressing the problem is it's not going to be easy. So I was on a panel. This is where I got a little depressing. I was on a panel a year ago right now, and we were all talking about the problem. We're like, oh, we're so vulnerable, and oh, we can't trust anything, and it's just everything's resonating, and we don't know where to. And at the end of this panel, this guy got up, and this guy was old. And he was, and everyone knew him there, and I didn't, because it was in Washington, D.C., and he'd been an ambassador, and I don't know where, but he'd been around a long time. And he scolded us, and he got up there, and he's like, you know what, we've had hard problems in the past, and we threw our hands up, we didn't throw our hands up in the air. We had the Cold War, and people said, oh, it's never going to end, and eventually we chipped away at it, from all these different things, and eventually that problem's gone, and we have new problems. But you're all up here, and you're acting like we can't solve this, like it's unsolvable. But it's not going to be one little thing. You're not going to take one little patch on a technology platform or something else. We're going to solve this by chipping away at it from all these different sides. And I think the technology platforms have a role to play. I think education has a role to play. I think journalism has a lot to do to make itself a stronger institution. And I think there are policy things that we should do. To talk specifically about some platform policies, I think, I'm on the last two slides. I think it's important to kind of look at what innovation's happening. I think Facebook's doing a good job. They're starting to do a good job to think about coordinated inauthentic behavior and target maybe the troll activity. But as we've seen, like once a disinformation campaign takes root, we actually have a much more complex problem, because we've got people who are sincere believers who are part of that disinformation campaign, and our freedom of speech values mean that we don't want the platforms to take the same kind of action against people that are sincere believers as they might take against an online troll. And so we have to kind of figure out what those vulnerabilities are. How do we stop campaigns quickly enough so people don't become sincere believers of the propaganda? But also, how do we start dealing with these more kind of complex arrangements of disinformation that aren't just bots and trolls? We've also got the problem of working the refs, where people in power right now have benefited from the manipulation of these platforms, and that any attempt to kind of stop that manipulation from happening is going to be grounds for some political folks to say that a platform is biased. And so I think it's really important that technology companies understand that this is a disingenuous attack, and that technology is not, they'll say that you're not neutral. Well, technology has never been neutral. Those of us that are in HCI have always talked about this. There's no neutrality. There's values. It's not about right versus left, but it's about a commitment to certain kind of values. And I think one of the commitments that we need to make is to supporting democratic discourse, a commitment to supporting democratic discourse, and that tech platforms need to identify their own and own their own values, to anchor themselves in their values, to grow roots, or they risk kind of getting bowled over by these political influence campaigns that are targeted at them. And finally, I think this is probably this is the slide I added for you all, kind of most relevant for Mozilla. It's like, how do we help people navigate these spaces to help restore and support trust in information systems? If disinformation is sort of an attack on our trust in information systems, how do we help better understand, so how do we help users be more resilient in these spaces? Sort of to better understand the provenance of the information they see, where it comes from. For that graph we have of the disinformation campaign that gets copied and pasted all over the information system, how do we help someone say, hey, you know what, this same article 90% appears in 90% of the same form in these 7 other places, and to give people those kinds of cues to say, no, you're not actually triangulating, you're seeing the same thing in 4 different places. I think that's really important. I think there's other kinds of innovations. I'd love to have conversations about what we think might work to help information consumers and information participants, which we all are, become more resilient in this spaces. And I am hopeful, but I think it's going to take a lot of change in a lot of different, from a lot of different sides, and I just want to chip away and not throw our hands up in the air. As I was told last year, I've taken that to heart. I think we should chip away at this problem from all sides. All right, thank you. I'd also like to thank a host of students and collaborators, very much including Emma Arif, Tom Wilson, Leo Student, and John Robinson, who've been sort of integral in different ways on this research, and others that are here.